Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm Karen Solomon, as Molly introduced me. This is a panel to sort of kick off the summit, thinking about alternative pathways from a big, broad perspective, not focusing right at your institution at this time. So we're going to take a view, looking out, bringing a group of folks here up on the stage that are looking at the national and the state perspective, but also another person that has been working closely with helping many institutions think about, discuss, explore different alternative pathways. And so this morning, what we're going to do is have Sally Johnstone actually be our first speaker, talking about that perspective of what she's seen out there as she's working with different institutions, her professional experience that she's had with her own institution. And then we're going to shift and focus on the national perspective and then the state perspective. What we've tried to do with this panel is keep our comments relatively brief. I've got a few questions in case you're a quiet group this morning. But after the panelists have spoken, we're going to have a few questions and then open it up to the room. And this summit is really designed to be one to allow all of you the chance to explore and think around all the different edges of the topic that we're here to talk about over the next 2 days. So I'm not going to take any more time up here at this point. I'm going to ask Sally to come on up and share her thoughts and ideas.
Good morning, everyone. It's a treat to be able to be here, and I live in Salt Lake, so I really enjoy not having to be somewhere else. And this time we made Iris come here. She and I were working together day before yesterday, but in D.C. So there's a lot of you that I know, many that I don't know, and I look forward to getting to know those that I don't know over the next day and a half. I think it'll be a lot of fun. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a gathering in Arizona that was really a combination of educational entrepreneurs and investors. Very little, by the way, of educators, but it was very interesting for that reason. And what I found is almost every session, the notion of competency-based education came up. Whether it was a product that somebody was thinking about that would work in either a K-12 or higher ed framework, or it was a different way of thinking about supporting institutions for their development in some new directions. I was truly amazed at how pervasive the notion of CBE was. For those of you that have never read too much about this, you know that, or for those of you that don't, sorry, this is, the computer up here is pervasive. Yes, well, isn't it always? Competency-based education, I think, is very attractive right now for a number of reasons. And one of them is that it's flipping the relationship between time and learning. So we're not talking about learning being a group sport anymore. It really can be individualized, whether one uses that or whether one engages in learning face-to-face or in an electronic environment. When you shift into a CBE framework or competency-based education framework, you're basically saying we're putting the student in front of everything else. It is the student who will determine the pace at which he or she will learn, and once he or she reaches mastery, then that person proceeds. It's not, here's the term, everybody start here, roll along, end here, and those of you that get it, get a good grade and are able to progress. Those of you that don't get it, your option is to repeat the whole term. We have the technological capacity, we have the knowledge of instructional design and the science of learning at our fingertips right now that we can really change the way we operate in terms of helping all students be successful at what they're trying to do, and not do so in the ways that we've already tried it before. As Karen intimated, thanks to some funding from the U.S. Department of Labor, which is Mary Alice's old shop, thank you. Those of you that are working on TAC grants or Department of Labor grants, this woman was part of designing all of that and making it happen. But thanks to some funding from Labor and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're working, we WGU, and some of my colleagues are here in the audience, we are working with 11 different community colleges around the country to help them develop their own competency-based program. And I see one of our partners back there who I know will be sharing some of what they're learning and what they learned and took into their CBE program. It's been fascinating for me, and there are now almost 800 students enrolled at those colleges, and they are in 5 different states, so that means 5 different jurisdictional issues that tend to arise. They're in 3 different regional accrediting areas. That means different activities in that regard. But one of the important pieces of this around competency-based education and moving in that kind of direction was the original vision of the governors. And there are several people in the room that were involved in helping design WGU when it was first considered. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that WGU really is a proof of concept. It can work. At Western Governors University right now, we have over 45,000 students currently enrolled and over 30,000 graduates. The cost has been constant for the last 4 or 5 years. Darren, is it 5? Yeah, last 5 years of under $6,000 a year, and that includes your learning resources. The average time to a baccalaureate degree is about 3 years for our students. Students are highly satisfied, with 98% willing to recommend others, and that is our most common way of getting new students, recommendations from former students. Over 80% of our graduates are employed in the field, in their field of study. That's a lot higher than the national average. On inventories, national inventories like the National Student Engagement Survey or National Student, NESE, as well as the CLA, Collegiate Learning Assessment, our students score better than not just the national average, but way off the charts with regard to online similar institutions. Why is this important? And I think that's what we're trying to hit on with this panel. And Mary Alice and Iris live in the public policy world, and they're going to help paint that picture in a broader framework. But what is important, I believe, and why CBE is so important right now, is that it's enabling individualized learning. It's shifting the whole institutional framework to support individuals. And we pay that lip service at every college and university in the country, but very frequently we can't do it because we're not structured to be able to do it. The other thing that I think makes CBE so critically important is that it harmonizes quality across the curriculum. All students are mastering the materials that the faculty have determined constitutes the critical framework for a particular course or a program, and that doesn't matter who's teaching the course, whether the course is offered in a summer session or a full term or a winter term or whatever. The other thing that makes it very important and really interesting, I think, is that when planned properly, and we're working on those things right now with our partner colleges, you can lower the costs and keep them lower. We just had a convening last week that Stacy Clausen helped us manage at the Gates Foundation with our partner colleges and our colleagues at NCHEMS, Dennis Jones and Karen Paulson, to pull together models of new financial ways of thinking about how our partner institutions are making choices so that they can lower the costs and keep what they're doing sustainable. Now, one of the things that we've learned working with these partner colleges over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that there really are some discrete design principles. And there's a link on your resource page in your folder to an article that just came out a few weeks ago in Change magazine that my colleague Luis Suarez and I wrote, that's really around what are the design principles. If you're thinking about starting a competency-based education program, what do you need to pay attention to? And these are really intense and complex. There's 5 of them. And the first one is that your degree has to reflect robust and valid competencies. Whoa, not a surprise. The other thing about it is students have to be able to learn at a variable pace, and that's a real challenge for a more traditionally oriented program, whether it's online or face-to-face or anything else. We're asking faculty to work with students differently. The third one is that effective learning resources for the students are available anytime and are reusable, because otherwise there's no point in all of this. The fourth one is a little internal pragmatic, but you have to keep some good mapping and be able to explain how the competencies map to courses, which map to learning outcomes, which map to assessments. And that's some of the issues that I think your accreditors and external reviewers are very interested in assuring actually happens. The fifth one of these is that you have to have secure and reliable assessments. The integrity of the program, and hence the institution, is really riding on the assessments. And that's of terrific interest not only to anyone who's paying attention to the integrity of the program, but certainly to external evaluators as well. I'm going to end that here, hopefully giving you sort of a broad perspective on a lot of this, and I truly look forward to interacting and working with you over the next day and a half. And I will turn this back to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Sally is not only with Western Governors University, but has been a long-time leader and very involved in WCET for many, many years. At this point, I'd like to now introduce Iris Palmer. She's Senior Policy Analyst at the National Governors Association.
Mary Alice was next.
Oh, Mary Alice is going next. I'm sorry. Mary Alice McCarthy, Senior Policy Analyst at the New America Foundation. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be here and spend these next 2 days with you, so thank you for the invitation. I'm putting this, it is a little ubiquitous here, yeah, I see what you mean here, okay. So I'm embarrassed to say that I'm the only one with the PowerPoint slide. I guess that shows you, how I have to think through these things, and I'm also setting my timer so that I don't go on too long. Because the truth is, when you start talking about competency-based education, it's a bit like going down a rabbit hole, and you can spend lots of time, defining things and figuring out things. But what I'm here to talk about is competency-based education and the role of federal policy in relation to competency-based education. So why federal policy? Specifically, I'm going to talk about how the rules and regulations around access to the federal student aid program affect the ability of institutions to design and implement and deliver competency-based programs. Obviously, the federal student aid program has a big influence on institutional behavior, so the degree to which it can be a source of support and also sort of quality control around the development of these programs is obviously of great interest to folks in Washington. And to all of you, I'm sure. And I think it reflects a growing understanding of the tremendous potential that competency-based education offers to improve quality, to improve affordability, and to improve student outcomes. The question is, how do we make sure it moves that direction and not in other unintended directions? So just a quick roadmap. I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about competency-based education, then get into how federal policy, as it is designed today, specifically rules and regulations around access to Title IV federal student aid, affect competency-based models, and then considerations for if we were going to change policy, what do we need to be thinking about, and what should be driving that conversation? And then hopefully, if I have a minute, talk a little bit about competency-based education and alternative credentials, though maybe we'll get to that in the discussion period. So Sally already provided a great definition of competency-based education. I was so happy I was going after her because I knew she would be able to do that much more clearly. This can be, you can spend so long trying to do this, but let me just offer up these two terms. These are both the Southern Association of Colleges recently issued a policy statement around competency-based education. I don't know if the Higher Learning Commission has. Anyway, these are definitions from that. So it's nice to see an accreditor sort of jumping in and sort of defining terms. And as you can see, the key is that a CBE program is one that is based on outcomes, and that student progress is linked to demonstrations of proficiency. And I mean, at its core, that's what it is. But as we'll see, that's a very broad definition. And in fact, competency-based models, there's a tremendous diversity of competency-based models. You can take that definition of sort of measuring learning and not time, and you can implement it in many different ways. So competency-based programs, for example, can exist very comfortably within the traditional classroom-based, semester, credit hour-based program. And basically, it's just, schools or programs looking at their programs of study and figuring and sort of mapping back from what are the competencies a student needs to be competent or proficient in this area, and then designing the entire program backwards. And lots of institutions do that already. Then we can move to things where it does get a little bit more unlinked from time, and programs are really organized around competencies that are not grouped into courses, and students are able, as Sally was talking about, to be able to move forward in an individualized and self-paced way. This is where we start to move away from, or start to get into some issues with Title IV federal student aid and how it's dispersed. Okay? As we move away, too, from sort of the classroom-based model, it also allows for this possibility of an unbundled delivery model in which the faculty role is broken down into discrete functions of curriculum development, delivery of instruction, and assessment, and all of those can be performed separately. And we see that in competency-based programs like WGU and some others, that unbundling is happening. And then finally, we get all the way to the sort of most extreme end, which are these new programs, Southern New Hampshire's and Campella's, which are direct assessment programs, which don't include credit hours at all. They literally are 100% competency-based, which kind of, we'll get to that in a minute, but they're 100% competency-based, but also self-paced and unbundled. What's important about this arrow is that as you travel from the left to the right, federal policy becomes more problematic for you. So right now, federal policy for those programs that are sort of designing transparent learning outcomes for courses is not a problem. For these programs at the very end, it's quite complicated. So complicated that in 2005, the Department of Education, or Congress actually, amended the Higher Education Act to try to sort of think about like how Title IV eligibility could be granted for programs that really did want to do straight up direct assessment of competencies that was not linked to time. And they came up with this provision in which a school can require approval from the Secretary of Education to deliver programs that are, in fact, 100% competency-based. And I think that these three parts of the law sort of really point out for us just how complicated and unsatisfying this can be. So if we see, it says in 2005, the Act was amended to include the following authority, which is that institutions, instead of using credits, hours, or clock hours as measures of student learning, may use direct assessment of student learning. So the words instead of sort of raise this possibility of like, oh, we don't have to use credit hours anymore. We can just think about a program of study. What does somebody need to know and be able to do to be competent and proficient at it, and design our program that way? And how long it takes the student to complete it is not the issue. The issue is what do you need to know and be able to do. So very promising. That is followed by the next sentence, or next paragraph in the law, which says, the application that the institution sends to the department must specify the equivalent number of credit hours or clock hours for a direct assessment program, including how those equivalencies are established. So it's like, well, okay. So you can think about competencies, please, do the thought experiment, that's great, but then at the end of the day, we need you to map it all back to these units that we use to disperse federal aid. And why is that? Why do we have to do this? Why does the department demand that the equivalencies be established? Because that's what the secretary is going to use to determine whether or not the program meets the minimum requirements of an academic year. So at the end of the day, the ability to participate in the Title IV program is not going to be based as much, from the department's perspective, on the quality of the competencies. It's going to be based on the ability to map it back to the requirements of an academic year. So as you can see, federal policy isn't actually well designed in terms of being able to work with these programs as they are, or in their purest forms. And just to sort of clarify a little bit more of what that looks like, federal student aid is organized around the credit hour, and it's organized around students enrolling in courses at a certain point, finishing, enrolling in terms at one point, finishing a term, enrolling in the next term, finishing that term. And the aid is designed to be dispersed in segments across their learning so that they don't get all the money at once. And it's also, the rules and regulations are designed to determine that that student is actually progressing in their course of study. Well, that can be very difficult for a competency-based program that doesn't have normal terms. I mean, a student enters a competency-based program theoretically, and when they enter, who knows when they're going to finish it, So you can't do the terms. So how do you distribute the aid? You don't want to give it all up front. There's all sorts of questions around that. Similarly, with enrollment, federal student aid is tied to the intensity of study. Is a student part-time or full-time? And the aid amounts differ. If you're in a competency-based program, how do you think about whether or not you're part-time or full-time? You're sort of in or out, right? And are you part-time just because you didn't make very much progress in a particular period of time? Maybe it was a really hard time, but you were working full-time. Are you full-time because you made lots of progress? So it raises lots of sticky questions. And finally, satisfactory academic progress. The department needs to know that students are actually studying and learning and moving forward, which they measure through GPA and numbers of credit hours completed in a term. Competency-based programs don't have GPAs. And they, again, this whole question of terms and how do you do that. So these are where we see how these two systems don't really map onto each other very well. And it doesn't mean that they're impossible to map onto each other, but it does mean that institutions have to do a lot of gymnastics in order to map everything back to things that make sense for the department. And from the department's standpoint, keep in mind they are administering $150 billion of taxpayer funds. They are very concerned about making sure that it's going to students who are enrolled in real programs, who are actually studying and who are making progress and who are not sort of just who are not just floundering in there. So it is a really genuine, difficult problem. So as we think about then, what should we do at the federal policy front? Should we, a lot of the discussions in Washington today are how should we think about the federal student aid program in relation to competency-based education? What should drive that discussion? And so I think, first of all, folks who are thinking about this are thinking about how can competency-based education contribute or not contribute to our major goals for higher education, which I've listed here as access, completion, affordability, quality, relevance, and equity. And we're already seeing quite a bit of, good evidence that CBE can be a model for increasing access, completion, and affordability. So I would say the major focus in Washington, and Iris can correct me, is on thinking about how do we gather more evidence around that. The outcomes from WGU are awfully promising. How do we start, though, to really rigorously look at and test and evaluate how these programs affect different learners, who they're good for, how they affect completion rates, how much they can actually lower costs for students. And so I'll talk a minute about, there's lots of things going on right now, lots of different initiatives and monies and programs and grants designed to gather evidence. The next three questions, though, are much more difficult. And this is where I think the policy discussion is sort of bogged down. Because the ultimate question of how do you determine the quality of competency-based education programs, who determines them, what does quality look like, are very, very difficult. Sally and Lewis's article, which was just fabulous, by the way, I think sets some parameters of like what the quality characteristics of good CBE programs look like. And as you said, a lot of it comes back to the quality of those assessments. But when we think about our quality assurance systems and how we think about quality and how programs are accredited or allowed to participate in the program, I don't know that we have a lot to go on in terms of determining what make up quality assessments. But if we can build systems or programs that use and have some sort of understanding of what quality assessments are, we have the possibility to really scale high quality education in a way that's not possible today. But a lot of that, I believe, depends upon how the assessments are created, whether or not they're created within institutions, whether or not they have to be linked to external validation, whether or not they're created by groups of institutions. What do they look like? What are their components? And I think everybody's trying to figure out who's going to come together, who's going to figure out the answer to that question. Because if we could, I think we could see the possibility of scaling high-quality programs. And when you can scale high-quality programs that are based on agreed-upon high-quality assessments, you can make a lot of dent into equity issues, because that would mean that people in different institutions, in different regions, in different states who were taking similarly designed and validated assessments could be able to say, my learning is just as good as your learning. So this is where we see the possibilities, but we also see the risks of opening the spigot of Title IV to institutions that are all doing individual assessments that sort of, again, just create even more noise and confusion in the higher ed landscape about what does this degree mean, what's behind it, how do I know how this assessment was developed, who developed it, is it different from this assessment? So I do think assessments are at the key of this, and I think we don't quite know how to have a conversation with our partners in the quality assurance system about how to really tackle it. I think I've probably passed time, so so as I said, there are lots of things going on in the area of experimentation and evaluation, including the department is going to issue is going to run some experimental sites that I think will really tackle some of these issues around attendance and access and completion and affordability, and be able to test that in a very rigorous way. There is still a piece of legislation on the Hill. Not that anything's really moving these days, but there's interest there in demonstration projects. First in the World does have money for the development of assessments in particular. Lots of interest in that. That Round 4 of TACT also has a big focus on competency-based models. And, the Department of Education's research arm in general is dying to sort of test some of these programs. And, if you're interested in that, please let me know, because I can put you in touch with some of the program officers there. But there's a real effort to just gather some evidence and learn more before we start tinkering with policy too much. Finally, the other thing that I want to say about, CBE and its tremendous potential for creating more sort of quality in higher education is it also, once you start making assessments and competencies the currency of learning, you create more possibilities to create interoperability among credentialing systems. Okay? Because then what a credential says somebody can do becomes transparent to employers, becomes transparent to industry associations, so you can start to see some design principles around credentialing that can be shared outside of higher education with other credentialing systems. Which, I think we're learning that non-degree credentials are becoming more and more important in the marketplace. So competency-based education is a way to bring the higher education community into a common dialogue with other credentialing systems, and that common currency would be competencies. So I think with that, I'm sure I've talked way too long, so looking forward to the discussion. Oh, can I just, if anyone is interested in those issues around how Title IV doesn't map on very well to competency-based education models and how institutions get around that, because there's lots of interesting workarounds. There's a paper by Stephen Porter that's in your packet that I cribbed all of that from. So it's a really great, very clear, very concise summary of the misalignment between Title IV and competency-based education.
So just a minor amendment, there's a link on your resource page to that. The actual article is not in the packet. If you're searching through your packet, I think you missed it. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Iris Palmer. She's Senior Policy Analyst of the National Governors Association.
I'm really glad that Mary Alice went first because she did a really great job laying out all the complexity in tying policy for CBE programs and how, and how basically the system is not set up to support and scale these programs. And so that's, yeah, okay. So that's where I'm going to start from. And since my constituency is obviously the governors and state policymakers, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the state of the state policy conversation around this. And the short answer is that there just isn't a lot of conversation about this at the state level. They're kind of warily eyeing it. They're looking at the federal conversation and thinking, okay, they're going to get it totally figured out on Title IV, and then we can just crib that and make it and put it into our state aid programs, and it'll all be fixed, and that'll be great. But of course, that's not how it's going to work. And so my colleague Kate Nilsson and I have come up with a framework for the different sort of frames of policy and how states can sort of start to look at these problems, because as Mary Alice said, they're very, very complex, and the people we work with don't necessarily want to get into all the complexity, but they need to have a framework for how to talk about it in their states. And we actually created this framework to be over both the K-12 competency-based conversation and the higher education competency-based conversation. Very different policy environments, clearly, but the conversations are happening almost completely separately. And that seems like a shame, because a lot of the conversation in K-12 is how higher ed won't respect the K-12 competency-based transcripts that are coming out of these competency-based high schools. And then the conversation in higher ed has no idea that anything's going on in K-12. So we've created this structure to try to bring together both of these to provide policymakers who are hearing about both of these conversations and not understanding how they're different or similar with a way to sort of provide further inquiry. And around each of these, I've come up with some examples of states that are beginning to wrestle with this, and I say beginning because it is in a very early stage in every single state. And some states, they haven't even started to tackle different pieces of these, or excuse me, most states haven't started to tackle any of these, but there are actually some of these where I have not found any examples of states that have started to tackle it. So our structure is looking at delivery systems and the role of faculty, assessment and accountability, and remember this has to go over K-12 too, and that's a huge one in K-12, and it actually should be, I would argue, in higher education, at least with the quality assurance piece that Mary Alice was discussing. Funding, which is the biggest one in higher ed and less of an issue in K-12, strangely enough. And then communications. How do you start to move people's perception of college and high school away from the traditional model that they all went to, the ivy-covered buildings, the teacher with the apple in the front of the classroom? How do you start to move those perceptions? So with delivery systems and the role of the educator for higher education, I've pulled this into two different roles. How do you engage your faculty appropriately at a state level as you start to have these conversations at more scale? And how do you start to enable some of the technology solutions, mostly the student management systems? Is there a state role in starting to help create a scaled student management system that actually would work with a competency-based, not time-based model? So my example for a state that's working really well with faculty is Washington State, because they're actually the state, well, they're trying. Yeah, it's a hard conversation to have, and I think the instinct for many states is to wait to engage the faculty or the faculty union in the case of Washington until the last minute. Well, Washington knew that that wouldn't work, that it would totally implode if they tried to do that. And so they brought the faculty union and faculty representation in at the very beginning of these conversations. And as they've worked with Sally and others to start to create a system-wide competency-based education program, they've really continued to work with the faculty, and it's slowed them down quite a bit in what they've been able to do, but at the same time, they're slowly getting buy-in, they're slowly trying to explain, and they're dealing with the fear that the faculty have that this is going to somehow replace them with part-timers. The idea of the unbundled faculty role is really scary to a lot of teachers or faculty who don't understand what it could look like. In my conversations with Washington, the idea of sort of team teaching and how in team teaching, different teachers have different roles, and that's more, faculty have different roles, and that's more what they're looking for rather than saying, oh, you can no longer assess your students or something like that, which is what there's a lot of fear around. So they've had a really great start of a conversation there, and they've started to push it forward. They've told me not to be too optimistic about it, but I do think it's a good model for how to start to have these conversations, even though we haven't necessarily gotten very far. And I know there's people from Washington in here, and I want to, every time I bring up an example, I want to say that you should definitely find those people because they're the ones who are the experts and who are going to know more in depth on how to actually execute these models. So the next piece is this technology piece. And Al Lind is here, and Kentucky is sort of my example with this. They're working on creating the Kentucky Commonwealth College, which is sort of the 4-year version of Learn on Demand, which many of you might know about, which is their the community college 2-year system-wide competency-based program, and then they're trying to do it on the 4-year side as well. And one of the things they're using is the Kentucky Virtual Campus student management system and student information system, and they've basically created this statewide, and they've been using it to sort of do more traditional online programs and helping bring all the online programs together. I'm looking at Al because I'm sure I'm getting this wrong, but they've been using it more traditionally, and now they're going to work on retrofitting it so it actually works for the Kentucky Commonwealth College, and it'll be a way for them to start to deal with some of these issues that are coming up in learning management systems, student information systems, course management systems, as institutions are dealing with this. So is there a role for the state to start to support some of those changes that need to happen in these systems, which I know for institutions are some of the most difficult problems that they face as they start to implement these and try to scale them, frankly, because right now it's all sort of happening by hand and very piecemeal. Go find Al if you want to hear more. And then the next piece is the assessment and accountability. So in K-12, this is very, very important, obviously, because sort of the way K-12 sees competency-based education is how can we loosen the accountability structure that has, you know, we test 3 through 8, everyone has to make a certain progress, all these pieces. How can we loosen it and make it more student-centered? Whereas in higher education, we're like, we have no control over what the learning outcomes are in our programs. Like, how can we start to at least articulate those learning outcomes well and start to make it more student-centered and allow students to move through more quickly? So for the assessment accountability piece in K-12, that's clearly a huge issue for them as they're moving to Common Core and how they look at how all this is being implemented. And I would argue in higher education, there may not be as strong of a state role in this, but I would say that policymakers need to be armed with a set of questions. A set of questions that allow them to sort of sniff out good and bad actors in this, because as Mariella said, the quality control is you know, policymakers and their staffs are not psychometricians. They don't have a PhD in how to create assessments. They don't really know what a good authentic assessment looks like if it came up and hit them. And frankly, I don't know that I would know that either. So what are some questions they can ask as programs are being proposed in their states, as providers are trying to come into their states, to say, okay, is this authentically high quality competency-based education, or is this just somebody taking what they were doing before, putting on the most recent buzzword and trying to sell this to me as something that it's not? And I don't know of any states that are actually working on this right now. I'm trying to work with the Competency-Based Education Network and some of the other people that are working on this to create this list, because I would really like to bring it out to our constituency and start to push people to look a little bit more closely on that piece. So the next piece is funding, and in here I'll call out Van. I don't know if he's in here, from Texas. There he is. So he's the one that can answer all the rest of your questions on this, but they're doing two things, and really Texas is farther along in sort of asking these questions than any other state I've found. And if I'm wrong on this, please come find me because I need more examples for our issue brief. But so for the student aid in Texas, they have been directed by the legislature to look at how to provide student financial aid to competency-based providers. Now, this may just be how do you provide it to private providers, but hopefully what they're going to do is start to think about and think through some of the questions that Mary Alice was asking about how you can kind of decouple this and still have a quality assurance from the credit hour. I have hope. We'll see. They're not very far along yet. And then for state appropriations is obviously a huge, huge issue in higher education. So many states are going to performance funding, which is almost entirely based on credit hours. State appropriations right now, much of it is based on the full-time student, how you define that, the academic year, a lot of the points that Mary Alice made. Texas is currently working on a paper with the RAND Corporation to figure out how to create an incentive for institutions to offer more accelerated programs. Now, this is in its very early stages, but the idea would be that the institutions would start to profit, or not profit, they would get an increased amount of money for the faster they accelerated students. This isn't it isn't competency-based at all right now, but it's the right kind of thought experiment that's going to start to bring us towards a place where we can actually start to have a conversation about how to decouple state appropriations from the credit hour a little bit more and make it a little bit more flexible, and in tangent with some of the other reform conversations that are happening in higher education state policy. So the last one is communications, and this can be a really, really tall order. When state policymakers think about higher ed, they really do just go back to their experience, and that can be a good thing in limited cases and not a good thing in a lot of cases. So my example here is Wisconsin, where the Flex program started with the Extension campus, and they started to create it there, and then they got the chancellor involved, and the chancellor then started to bring it to the legislature and the governor's office. And in Wisconsin, they had a little bit of an ally in the fact that the governor's experience reflected the problem that they were trying to solve, right? So he doesn't have his bachelor's degree. He dropped out of college, and he sees this as a way for him to go back, or anybody like him to go back and be able to finish more quickly, more effectively, and to get credit for things that they obviously have a lot of experience in, right? So in their case, that worked in their favor, and they were able to get a lot of political support in the way that they ended up communicating the program. Now, of course, you need to communicate to your different audiences. I'm focused on the state policy conversation, so for me, that's the whole faster, cheaper is great. That isn't so great for many of the faculty. So when you're having the faculty conversations, clearly that's not the communications tactic that you want to use. But in Wisconsin, as far as getting their state policy apparatus and people just involved and interested, it worked really, really well. So I really do hope that you all have a lot of good questions for us. So I'm just going to remind you again to start thinking about them. And with that, I'm going to sit back down.
And the question is, how could the national and state agencies and accreditors work together to develop a more coordinated system of approvals for institutions to offer alternative pathways? And I'll let you two duke it out on who wants to start on this answer.
I mean, I think the question gets at the heart of the issue of how do we start having a conversation across these different sort of approval levels that creates some consistency and reduces some of the uncertainty right now that institutions face when they want to do these programs. And I mean, I think first of all, I think that there needs to be a much more open and again, robust conversation between national and state agencies and accreditors around what are the, what are the approval, what are we talking about when we talk about quality? How do we find it? If we are going to really move to programs that really measure learning, and that's how we're going to distribute our aid dollars, what does it mean to do that? And I do think things like having more discussions around what are the quality characteristics of specific credentials would be helpful, and just what does it mean to, what are the quality characteristics of developing competencies and linking them to the assessments, as like Sally and Lewis talked about in their article. I just think that I fear that we may end up with 6 different processes from the regional accreditors that don't necessarily talk to one another, and then different states doing different things. And I just think that would really miss the potential for competency-based education as a vehicle for scaling quality. So.
I think we'd be lucky if we ended up with 6 processes. I think it's much more likely that we end up in sort of a state authorization situation where we have 50 different ways to do it and everybody's looking at it slightly differently. And so I think that the conversation really needs to start, and I think the good news is that there's a lot of awareness that the conversation needs to be happening, and that there are conversations that are going on at the state, at the national level, and actually with the accreditors, a lot more than there are with the states. So as we start to think about how we don't want 50 different approaches, we do need to start authentically bringing state agencies into this conversation, and so far, I'm just thinking about one example where they were directly engaged and they didn't have a lot to say because they didn't have a lot of information about the topic and they hadn't done a lot of thinking on it. So that's really got to change, and we should probably start with some of the agencies, with some of the associations, not just us, but SHIO and CSL and those people actually helping their constituencies start to think about these topics because they haven't yet.
Sally?
Let me weigh in on that a little bit. And Karen, as you know, and I believe both of you were engaged with this about a year or so ago, we finally had a gathering of, yeah, that's what I thought, of all of the accrediting associations, both the regionals and some of the professionals. The representation of the states, but it was pretty low-keyed. Yeah, and the Department of Ed. Now, it was a great start. Unfortunately, most of the folks that were there from the Department of Ed are not at the Department of Ed anymore, which it happens, but I think it's a major setback in terms of keeping that conversation going, because that's the nature of the issue. How do the regionals act as gatekeepers around the Title IV issues? On the other hand, I think there's some other promising events emerging. I'm not sure that the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, when their report comes out this June, is going to make a dent in anything, but I think they'll be able to raise the issues, of how we begin to talk about what is the future of the Carnegie Unit / credit hour, both in terms of K-12 and higher ed. And at least getting the issues out there can restart a conversation that, Karen, I think goes right back to some of the things that you're intimating with that question. I think another promising development is AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They've just started a project that builds on LEAP, Liberal Education for America's Promise, but is looking at the proficiencies that are expected across what we think of as general education courses. Now, I think of proficiencies and competencies as interchangeable. That's fine. I mean, whatever language anybody wants to use. But the issue is, if we get the kind of cross-sector, in terms of at least higher education, decisions or models that begin to emerge that can then go into the various academic discipline associations, I think we're going to move the needle. So it's moving.
I agree, it's moving. It's been challenging. There's so many other complicating factors from an accrediting perspective. The accreditors approved the first direct assessment programs just within the past academic year. So we've had 4 institutions were the first really out of the box, or 5 institutions when you really count the system and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, as another Capella, Northern Arizona, and Southern New Hampshire University were the first real pioneers out there. But what's been interesting from an accreditor standpoint is some of the challenges related to some of the other regulation that's come along in recent years, such as contractual relationships that many of our institutions may be engaged with unaccredited institutions, whether they're institutions that are international institutions or not recognized by a USDE gatekeeper. Also, the issue of prior learning assessment and how institutions have developed systems and processes robust enough to really be able to allocate credit for that, and whether there should be or are limits with some of our institutions. What's interesting for me is the challenge of correspondence education. That we, in regulation and adopted by most of our accrediting agencies, is the exact federal regulation of the difference between distance education and correspondence education, and how that plays out for institutions in this different type of alternative pathway, and what approvals they need for that also. So I want to, yes, go ahead.
Let me just add one thing. For those of you that happen to be in the North Central or Higher Learning Commission region, count your blessings. You guys created, I think, the simplest pathway going from a traditional program into competency program / direct assessment of any of the accreditors thus far, any of the regionals. So Karen, thank you guys. It's not onerous. I mean, it's basically a checklist, so you don't have to be afraid of contacting North Central anyway, the Higher Learning Commission, as you embark on these kinds of activities. It's not quite as clear in most of the others. And Mary Alice, the framework that you brought up from Sachs, interesting, but it still isn't well translated into what does that mean. And that's tough, whereas at the Higher Learning Commission of the North Central Association, you've translated it. You've said this is what you need to think about.
And I think in our region, we had 4 different institutions that were really anxious and eager and actually had done a lot of advanced work. They weren't just starting to think about competency direct assessment degrees. They actually had done their research and developed some pretty good models, and then came to the commission, and we ran a pilot for those institutions. In the meantime, we've only had a handful of institutions actually come forward beyond that initial group. Many of our institutions, I think, Mary Alice, are in, when you put up that slide of the 3 different phases or types of competency, many of our institutions are in that middle phase. Or that middle segment, and haven't quite made that leap to the far right side. And for our commission, and I can't speak for all the accrediting agencies, but we've understood that competency-based education has been around for decades. What institutions in our region need to gain approval for, above and beyond what they're doing right now, is it when it moves to that direct assessment, truly separated and just based on competencies, and that's the only point. Otherwise, our criteria for accreditation require that wherever and however education is provided, that the institution must be able to demonstrate quality. And so we've put it back into our criteria, not into a separate process from that standpoint. Sally, I'd like you to take the lead on this question, and others, please feel free to join in. But that is, how have you experienced employers responding to this new initiative that our institutions are beginning to test?
By and large, what we found at WGU and what our partner colleges around the country have found is that employers really are impressed. And part of why they're impressed is they're asked, what is it that you expect of an employee that you would want to hire in terms of the skill sets and the knowledge that he or she must have. Now, in the WGU model, we include major employers in what we call our councils. Those councils are both employers and academics, but the issue is we're trying to pay attention to what is it that employers are expecting? How is the field changing? And this is particularly pertinent in healthcare. Huge issues of changes not only in regulations, but certainly in expectations and how hospitals work and healthcare agencies work. And the only way to stay on top of that is to really have the employers working with you. In Ohio, the employment, or the employers, the associations of people who, well, the technical associations, the trade associations, actually came together a number of years ago in the field of IT and came up with their expectations of what a particular degree would mean in terms of skills and knowledge. And Sinclair College in Ohio has taken that and worked out of that framework and the revisions that have gone on from the employer community to create the framework for their IT degrees. Huge acceptance, really engaging. In Austin Community College is another of our partners, and what they did, because this was a TAC grant and the notion was these are displaced workers who need to move into the workplace, they went out and solicited employer partners. And the employer partners weren't just signing on to say, oh yeah, we think this is a good idea. They actually engaged them and basically said, we want you to open up internships. They don't have to be paid, but when a student graduates from our two-year program, they need a place to go. In addition to that, with a number of the employers, and that number is really growing because the Austin area is one of the high need areas for skilled labor, the employers were willing to offer interviews, and that became part of the degree program. Doesn't mean they had a job where they were going to hire someone, but people out of the personnel department in these partner these partner companies were offering a real interview to students who then had to prepare for that and learn what in the world that would mean. So we've found a lot of acceptance. And in terms of external validation of that, WGU does third-party surveys, and the employers of WGU students are rating their performance, that is WGU grads, rating their performance very, very high, like 97%, and are anxious to consider hiring more WGU grads. And again, we find that in some fields working more pervasively than others. But there seems to be very broad acceptance when an employer understands what it is that a student will be able to do when he or she graduates with a degree. So it's a definition of the degree itself and its implications.
Mary Alice.
Yeah, I agree with Sally that, I mean, when you talk about competency-based education to a group of industry association or employers, it's sort of like light bulbs go off, I find often, where it's like, oh, you know, we're talking about the same thing. And there just seems to be sort of, again, a common language and a common currency. So I do think that in Washington, there's a number of industry associations. There's a recently, the Business Roundtable is working with a group of industry associations called the National Network of Business and Industry Associations that are sort of looking at ways to build competency models that they're hoping they can work with institutions, you know, use as a sort of way to intersect with institutions of higher education. And I do think that this understanding that employers have a role to play in actually the whole competency identification and assessment piece. And if they don't play a role in that, we run a real risk, again, of just sort of, again, having a lot of credentials that are developed within higher education, that have currency within higher education, but that are not well understood outside of higher education. I also think, that's why I think it's, you know, one of the risks, I think, of competency-based education that I know many people are concerned about it is that it become too exclusively focused on CTE fields and that it just be sort of only for technical fields. And the overlap seems more obvious there, particularly in fields where there are existing things like certifications and occupational licenses. You have a way to sort of start the competency. You have an anchor, an external anchor from which to begin your competency development process. So it sort of makes sense there. I also think, though, that the Southern New Hampshire model is very exciting, and the LEAP, the ANCNU is very exciting, because with the Southern New Hampshire model, they're working directly with employers, and their students are incumbent workers, but they're earning a general associate's degree. So it's a really interesting example of an employer-based academic program in which the employer is seeing the value of general education and academic competencies. Because often the discussion that you'll have with employers is that I don't know what they're learning and it's not relevant, and they're not learning the right skills that we need, and what we need are critical thinking and writing and problem solving. So that SNU model is really interesting because it's actually core academic skills that employers then get to see how they are made relevant for work because they're contextualized around work. So I just think, again, when you start to focus on learning and proficiency, the conversation with employers becomes much easier. And I also just want to say one more thing is I think sometimes I find myself too often in conversations which is how do we engage employers, and trying to think about how to invite employers into the game. I think the question too is, we need employers to put more skin in the game and to feel involved and then be willing to support through resources the development of some of these programs. And the development of competency-based credentials is something that I think they're more likely to support with resources because it makes more sense to them. And hopefully that can be as true for academic credentials as it is for more CTE credentials.
So we have been, our entire chair's initiative every year, our chair picks an initiative, and this year it's connecting education and the workforce. So we've been having this conversation a lot. And we've actually been funded by Lumina Foundation to not only look at the academic side, but also more of the industry recognized credential CTE side and what's going on in competency-based there and how states can support and scale those particular programs, because they are, as I think Mary Alice said, they are different, but the structure does allow a way to authentically engage employers in a way that maybe traditional advisory councils that meet a couple times a year and have shrimp maybe don't. So that is what we're going to start looking at, because there's a lot of organizations in the space, as Mary Alice said, and we'd really like to come in and look at what all is going on and what the state role is in helping support that at both the CTE side and in the more academic, traditional academic side. So we've actually been funded to do both of those. So we're looking forward to starting to work more on that project.
We've mentioned K through 12, we've mentioned legislators, we've mentioned employers. Are there any other players that we need to be bringing into this conversation? Any other groups, any other stakeholders?
Well, one stakeholder that, I was recently speaking with somebody from Cincinnati from the Health to Professions Consortium, who is heading up the Health to Professions Consortium, which is a large TACT grant, and they're developing a modular kind of competency-based program for health informatics, I think, or a number of different healthcare occupations. And one of the things she talked about is that, they've got these high-fidelity competency-based online models, and they've got a student population that many of our first-time college goers, many of them are older, have families or working. And wouldn't it be great if some of our community-based organization partners could deliver this program? Why should, it's not classroom-based to begin with, and couldn't we, and so it sort of gets to that question around the contractual agreements and who else can partner in these programs, and what possibilities does competency-based education offer to bring in new partners to support students that might support the completion goal? If you've got good fidelity, in your programs, really then who helps students learn becomes the question.
I think that's a very good point. I know we've had a number of conversations with Goodwill Industries. They have an incredible network to support people around the country that are trying to move back into the workforce and their own employees. But in addition to that, besides just employers, I think it's important to pay attention to the industry associations, because they are very interested in getting engaged, and they've been part of some very interesting conversation and in the conversations. And that, too, is where I think we might see resources as opposed to individual employers, sort of pooled resources. And that's been true in a few areas. Certainly the Manufacturing Institute, Western Association of Food Chains, there's a variety of associations of employers, businesses, that are very interested in figuring out how to help people that are already employed in their industry progress.
Wonderful.
And that's, I think, part of the conversation.
Great.
So the last group I would just identify is so if you have to change the way that legislators and governors and policymakers see education, you have to change the way the public sees education too. So the students, the parents, the people who are going to be going through these programs need to understand that this is a high quality, authentic way to have an education, and that it's available to them. And so communicating to the public, and I've seen many of the Capella FlexPath ads in DC anyway, but I think they do a good job, but there needs to be a broader conversation and a shift in how we look at higher ed, so we're actually looking more at the outcome, and that's where we're judging quality rather than on the inputs, and that's a huge sea change in this country.
Great. I am done with my questions, and I think Molly has ceded the microphone to someone else out here.
Yeah, I have a question, not to make things too basic, but from where we are...
Can you identify yourself?
I'm sorry. Matt Redinger from Montana State University in Billings. It seems to me one of the stakeholder groups that need to be brought on board early on, and I'd like some perspective on how to make this happen, is faculty. How do you crack that nut?
That was when we began working with our partner colleges across the country. That was the first group with whom we spoke after the presidents. Then moving into helping faculty understand what this stuff was, how it worked, what kinds of choices and roles they may want to have, and what was their president or chancellor hoping could occur. Now, that conversation works better in the specific as opposed to the general, as you know. So if there's a project that is evolving and you can engage specific faculty who are interested, and they then become the spokespeople for the way in which things are progressing differently, it's a much more powerful message than the provost coming in and saying, now we're going to do this. It doesn't work that way.
We've got right over here.
Hi, my name is Ruki Jaramin. I'm from Argosy University, Chief Academic Officer and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Argosy was the first institution in the WASC region, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges region, to get approval for our direct assessment program. One of the things that, it's very interesting, by the way, everything that was said by every panel member, I think one of the biggest concerns is trying to come up with common terminology and a common taxonomy, if you will, of the different competency models that are out there. One of the things that happened 2 weeks ago in Phoenix was that the Lumina Foundation has an entity called the CBEN, which is a Competency-Based Education Network. And there are 20 institutions that are part of the CBEN network that are all either have approvals from their regional accrediting bodies for competency-based education and or seeking DOE approvals. And one of the things we walked away from 2 weeks ago was to actually put together the terminology and the taxonomy, because even the DOE, we realized, even with direct assessment, is struggling with, how do you classify all of these different entities that are out there with all of the different flavors. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with the CBEN and the work that is going on there, but I think that's probably one of the ways by which we can come up with a national dialogue, and which has already started, and I kind of just wanted to put that out there.
I'm very familiar, and I'm hoping that Allison Cadlick, who's helping Lumina run that, is the one that's going to help me come up with my questions for policymakers. I don't know if she knows that yet, but I absolutely am excited about the work they're doing and think that they're going to help bring some level of maybe not standardization, we don't say that in higher education, but some common understanding about the terms. And then we'd also like to take that common understanding of terms and bring it to the K-12 space and even the industry recognized credential space too. So,
Molly, do you have some more questions?
Hi. Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Carla Caselli. I'm with the Badge Alliance, and we're the latest iteration of Mozilla Open Badges. And I guess I'd like to challenge that comment about a universal taxonomy and say that what we're finding is that there are many different things springing up, and the concept of a universal approach to education is actually the thing that lots of people are working against at this point. So I'm curious that there's a lot of contextual learning or understandings that are happening that may not translate into this kind of universal conversation that I think everybody here wants to have. How do we start to address that? What does it mean when there are individual organizations and there are direct conversations that are happening between employers and learners outside of the traditional academic environment?
You know, I think there are two parts to a response to your question. On the one hand, both Mary Alice and Iris represent the policy world. And for that, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, folks need clear ways of thinking about stuff. So it makes sense to have some common definitions or frameworks. On the other hand, I think what I hope anyway, something that may go forward eventually, is not just these experimental programs in the Department of Ed, but the demonstration programs. And that there were a series of demonstration programs for distance learning in the late 1990s or 2000s or whenever that was, that really gave rise to the department understanding that something was different here. And I would hope that non-traditional, by every definition, institutions or organizations that are interested in entering into that dialogue would look at those demonstration projects or programs if it gets through Congress.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think the whole badging movement is very exciting, and one of the things that's exciting about it is that it's exciting, but it's also one of these things of like, oh no, what do we do with this? Another thing. But the movement around sort of creating an open standard for the badges that makes them sort of, again, interoperable. I mean, the idea that we have a whole bunch of, we have a universe of credentials out there, and for a long time, academic credentials have sort of held a big monopoly on the credentialing world in terms of people's ability to advance both educationally and in careers. And we're seeing the emergence right now, the sort of credentials are sort of coming out of the woodwork, and a lot of non-degree credentials in all sorts of fields, and badges are one of those. So what I would just say is that, yes, we don't want to necessarily, we want to find more and better ways for people to make their skills, knowledge, and abilities visible. But the degree to which we can have some agreement around what a credential is and how it links and how it, what its quality characteristics are, then badges can be a wonderful part of that landscape. And somebody can say, well, this is a badge, this is a certification, this is an occupational license, this is a degree, and this is how they're different. But this is how I can say, oh, if this person has a badge, it's, they might have similar skills as to this person with that. It's that infrastructure of which competencies are going to be the building blocks that I think are going to allow us to have more and better credentials, but credentials that sort of can sort of represent, that can sort of be responsive to where people learn things, and that they don't always learn them either in college or at work.
So I would agree with everything that's been said up here. I would just add one thing, which is there's a lot of education going on out there or training out there that doesn't even have a badge or anything else attached to it. If I think about my friends at General Assembly who provide like short-term training to mostly people with bachelor's degrees who actually want to get a job somewhere, they think this will help them get a job. And I've talked to them, and they've they're really trying to get into the state authorization conversation. They're not eligible for federal financial aid, obviously, but how do they start to approach these policy conversations without changing who they authentically are? And I think more and more those are the conversations that are going to be there, but that we do need to start with some kind of common understanding about what they are and what they aren't, I think.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation, and we could continue. But this is a summit, and we're going to have a flavor of a lot of different topics throughout the day. So I'm going to round out this panel, and I want to thank each of you, Sally, Iris, and Mary Alice, for joining us this morning. And you'll be around for questions and available in the hallway or in other sessions. So please, folks, continue your questions, continue your dialogue with one another when questions are raised. We're going to transition to another panel right now, but I'd like to say thank you very much.